Hi, this is Anil Bhatia, and in this special edition of TFR Insights for Cloud Foundry Summit, today we have with us Dormain Drewitz, Director of Product Marketing at VMware.
Happy to be here.
This event was supposed to be in person, right? And Cloud Foundry Summit is one of my favorite events. There are not only colleagues, there are like friends, and you build relationships over time. And you go and meet not only, I call it, instead of calling it open source community, I call it ecosystem because you have users who may not contribute back. They are vendors, they are, core developers, and there are foundation people who are, facilitating all of those things. So we will miss all of that. And of course, all the events that we go and hang out in the evening.
Oh, yeah.
But what we won't miss is all the technical sessions and all those things that will continue to be there. So COVID has, this is, we are directly impacted with that, but the whole world is kind of, it came to a standstill. But the fact is that we are locked inside our houses, but we are still functioning. We are running our businesses. We have food on table and everything else. And IT is playing a very big role there because of everything is online. We just pull our phone and order for Instacart, or wherever it is. So what I want to understand from you is that we don't talk about that aspect of COVID, that how it has affected a lot of industries. Some got impacted positively and some negatively. So talk a bit about this impact.
Yeah, and even where you can sort of phrase it as a positive impact, that still means that there's a lot of work to get done. And so, looking at essential retailers, of course, like the need to buy your groceries doesn't go away just because you're not moving around and leaving your home. If anything, it actually goes up, right? You're not eating out as much, so you need to keep that fridge stocked. And so looking at what essential retailers have been dealing with, their demand is as high as ever, but the way that their customers have to interact with them, like overnight, suddenly changes. Of course, we've had folks who've been ordering their groceries online. That's not totally new, but it's new for a lot of people. And so some of the essential retailers that we've worked with, immediately saw kind of 400% increases in the traffic loads that they were having to support. And so if you think about what that means in terms of those applications need to be designed to scale very quickly. So some of these, essential retailers didn't have time to do any load testing. They needed to know that this was just going to work. And fortunately, it pulled through. And that, I think, is a testament to the Cloud Foundry technology and ecosystem that many of these folks have been participating in for some time. But, looking at similarly in the sort of financial services world, the economic impact is one that immediately triggered a lot of additional activity that suddenly had to happen in terms of stimulus programs that were getting put into place and deadlines that were outside of the control of any particular financial institution. So that's another thing that's kind of challenging is as regulations come out, suddenly you need to move quickly to comply with those, but you don't get to make the decisions about when that happens. And so being able to turn on a dime and make changes, get things into production, know that it's going to scale to an unprecedented digital demand has really been, I think, the sort of crucible moment that a lot of folks who've been on this journey for a while, a journey you could call digital transformation, but really that's sort of kind of, what does that mean? Really, it's getting proven out now. What it means is, can I change my plans about my software and my digital experiences? Can I change those quickly? Can I respond to the market? Can I provide an experience that's seamless? So being able to scale and support scaling events is part of that.
No, you touched upon some great points. I have been thinking about it as well because it's going to change the industry, the way we develop, we deploy, and maintain, our infrastructure. Suddenly, what challenges that you see that, customers and users are facing that they were not even prepared? Because if I ask you 4 months before, that you'll be stuck in a home, you'll say, no, that's never going to happen. We never imagined this situation. Suddenly, we are here. And luckily, we are surviving. Of course, a lot of industries are impacted, but still. So to talk about what are the major challenges from the IT perspective companies are facing?
When you look outside of sort of the realm of where something like Cloud Foundry plays and supporting developers and applications, which is what my talk at the Cloud Foundry Summit is focused on, and I think what that community is certainly focused on, you do have a lot of other implications in terms of being able to support your employees suddenly all working from home, and so are they getting access to the applications that they need? Does your network support that? Right, a lot of folks hadn't necessarily provisioned enough capacity from say a VPN perspective, and so how do we quickly turn around the ability to support overnight everyone working from home, even folks that had some amount of work from home and flexibility built in? They hadn't necessarily sized for 100%. So that's something that we've certainly seen a lot of folks digging into and responding very quickly. Some other parts of VMware are actually very focused on those types of solutions. From sort of the digital experience side, as I mentioned, there's a couple big things. One is that scaling, the ability to have an application that you were expecting to get used. It's already available, but can it scale overnight and without the ability to do load testing? That's something that you don't necessarily get to turn that on. That takes some planning, both in terms of the architecture of the application. And so have you designed it so that, for example, in a microservices architecture where different parts that are going to get impacted differently can scale independently? Those are architectural decisions that you have to make at an earlier point. You don't get to do those when COVID hits. Of course, folks can respond rapidly to make those changes, but the folks that already were on that path are starting to reap the benefits. And other things in terms of, okay, how do we handle our infrastructure so that it's really elastic? And whether that's really having the infrastructure in, say, a cloud provider where, yes, technically it's available on demand, or even just within your own data center, there's a lot of capacity that's available, but can the application access it in a seamless fashion? And that's really where Cloud Foundry certainly provides some of that abstraction. Increasingly, Kubernetes is part of that equation in terms of how can we orchestrate that infrastructure in a way that allows the application on top of it to seamlessly stay available and constantly reconcile back to a manifest that describes how this application should work. So I think something that's really interesting in the lineup at Cloud Foundry is, how Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry have been on this convergence path for a couple of years as really starting to get interesting. And if you look at how the CF4 K8s architecture plays out, it's not like kind of a simple glue together type of approach. There's actually a very deep, thoughtful incorporation of a number of different elements of the Kubernetes ecosystem in now getting mapped into the elements of how Cloud Foundry adds additional layers of automation. So that, I think, is something that is evolving and has been evolving for some time in parallel. It's interesting to see that come out now as folks are just having to figure out, how do I support my business today with everything that's going on, and making sure that my applications can scale, and that we can change them. That's the other big thing. And there, some of the interesting feedback that I've gotten from folks and analysts who are out there talking to a lot of different users, and what they're noticing is sort of this bifurcation in terms of how folks have been approaching these types of efforts. And in some organizations, they're really doubling down on this so-called digital transformation effort. And those are usually the ones that have started to see some of that success. And to your point, this wasn't part of the plan. This was something where, they may have expected to reach a certain capacity for, say, a digital storefront experience in 2 or 3 years' time. That's now happening now. It's happening 2 or 3 years ahead of schedule. And so that's an acceleration that's happening. Projects that had been planned to happen over 6 months happening in 6 weeks. On the other side, there are organizations that have kind of, had a sort of token approach, I'd say, to digital transformation. They've put like maybe a center of excellence in place. They've done some pilot projects, but they've never really tested it against critical applications. They've never really put their core applications into that environment. And so all of these sort of fringe, exercises that they may have been doing haven't really prepared them for this moment. Those apparently are the types of efforts that are kind of getting disbanded at this time. And so this sort of, bifurcation in how people are handling COVID really, I think, proves out that the folks that have been on this path and taking steps to really make the hard changes, thinking about security and compliance and their entire path to production and their application architecture. It's hard work. And it sometimes doesn't feel like it's maybe yielding all the benefits you want. That's now like they're getting dividends in spades. Other folks that are kind of like, it's a dog and pony show. Like, well, now it's really, getting revealed as the dog and pony show, and it's getting abandoned.
You mentioned Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes. We have seen the evolution of Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes, from Bosch, and then the Kubo project, and then recently Cloud Foundry actually distribution as well. So how do you see the further evolution of Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes together? The interesting thing is when we look at VMware, the whole the family of VMware, Dell, and you guys also now own Pivotal, which is one of the biggest, kind of contributor stakeholders of the Cloud Foundry world. And then we have VMware, which is, I think, third largest contributor to the Kubernetes project. So I'm just curious about how do you see the evolution of these two adjacent projects, which themselves are part of Linux Foundation?
As you said, there's been projects to actually bring these technologies together for a couple of years. If you go back, you mentioned the Kubo project. That was launched 3 years ago. And so there's been a lot of learnings and maturing that's happened when you look at some of the requirements, particularly folks who had been using Cloud Foundry with a Bosch foundation for the infrastructure piece, and were very heavily dependent on it. It's taking a thoughtful approach to how you evolve that architecture is really important to make sure that folks continue to be supported. And so at the same time, Kubernetes has continued to evolve, and particularly with the introduction of things like Cluster API, that now has introduced a lifecycle management aspect to Kubernetes. There's been several different runs at the lifecycle management part of Kubernetes over the years, but Cluster API is now solving that in a way that brings a lot of potential to start to change how Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes work together. And so that's what the CF for Kate's project has really been focused on. So I encourage folks to take a closer look, because I think, when you see lots of different collaborations happening over the years, started trying to understand, like, why is this one different? It can sometimes be hard to capture at the surface. So that's something that I think, as I've looked into those details, it's very thoughtful, and it really takes into account a lot of different aspects of both of those architectures and ecosystems in a way that I think will have a lot of benefits to users.
Thanks for explaining that. Now, tell us a bit about, give us just kind of a teaser about your talk. What should people look forward to?
I've given a little bit of a teaser already, but just to put it in a little bit of context, there's two different sort of tracks, if you will, at the Cloud Foundry Summit. And one is really focused on sort of the project internals and contributors, and sort of really getting into the deep technicals. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of really interesting evolutions that have been happening there, that if you're close to that, then there's going to be some really important talks to catch there. And I would really encourage folks who are also really close to the Kubernetes ecosystem to take a look at some of those. The other track is really around the developer experience, which is something that Cloud Foundry has really provided and had this focus on a very app-centric and developer-centric approach to how do you provide cloud sort of infrastructure and orchestration, but with this application developer-centric view of things. And you could argue that that's something that's been missing from the Kubernetes ecosystem. And so bringing them together, Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes now gets this world-class leading edge developer experience layered on top of what has emerged as sort of the de facto standard for infrastructure orchestration. So the other track is really focused on that developer experience. My talk is in that particular section, and it's really sort of thinking about things at like, what do the businesses care about? And at the end of the day, with everything that's been going on with COVID, there's a number of stories that have been starting to emerge. And my goal was really to kind of accelerate the knowledge sharing that can happen in these communities as folks can see what other parts of the community are doing, other folks who are in their industry, maybe folks that are not in their industry. And also, I think it's a great testament and sort of victory lap, if you will, for Cloud Foundry, because a lot of the stories that I touch on really highlight how the folks who have adopted this technology are doing really well in this regard, right? They're able to make the changes quickly. They're getting new apps out to their users in 72 hours, in 8 days, under very tight deadlines. They're able to scale without load testing and to support, hundreds X the normal load that they would see. They're supporting all of those users, and that is a sort of moment to pause and reflect and recognize that Cloud Foundry has played an important role. Now, there's also a lot of things beyond just the Cloud Foundry technology piece that have helped those companies get there. And so the other part of my talk is thinking, okay, once you move beyond just the Cloud Foundry layer, what are some of the other things that have helped folks? Thinking about those application patterns and architectures, that goes hand in hand, thinking about that path to production and making sure that you've actually sort of worked through and tried to automate as much as possible all those steps that need to happen to get to production. There's some that get automated in Cloud Foundry, but some of those other steps in terms of compliance and security can also be very manual for a lot of people. To the extent that you can automate those, the faster you can go. And this is also dovetails really nicely with some of the research, for example, from Dora and the Accelerate book. If you've read that, they really kind of proved out statistically that continuous delivery approaches are what support folks in their ability to kind of outperform and be some of the elite software performers versus not. So we're seeing that in the Cloud Foundry community. So those are some of the things and sort of takeaways that I'm trying to pull together for folks, whereas a lot of these stories are happening, but I'm in a sort of special position where I get to hear a lot of them. And so I want to be able to share them out and let folks learn from those, and as well as acknowledge that this community has a lot to be proud of.
Thank you, Dormain, so much for taking your time out today. And we kind of deep dive into the Kubernetes Cloud Foundry world, and you also talked about your upcoming talk. I wish we were doing it in person, so we could have also hanged out and do all the fun stuff we do. But maybe next year. So once again, thanks for your time, and I look forward to your talk.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.